Welcome to the Next Level Human podcast. As a human, you have a job to do. In fact, you have 4 jobs: to earn and manage money, to attain and maintain health and fitness, to build and sustain personal relationships, to find meaning and make a difference. None of these jobs are taught in school, and that is what this podcast is designed to do: to educate us all on living our most fulfilled lives through the mastery of these 4 jobs. I'm your host, Dr. Jade, and I believe we are here living this life for 3 reasons and 3 reasons only: to learn, to teach, and to love. In this podcast, I will be learning, teaching, and loving right along with you. I'm grateful to have your company. Here's to our next level. Okay, everybody, welcome to today's show. Today I have a special guest, and many of you who have listened to this may know exactly why I have this guest on, because I love talking to other professionals and other individuals who are really trying to parse apart the, research and art and science of what is weight loss and really bust myths, because as we know, there is a lot in this industry that is just not very good for the people who really need the help. And so I have someone on today, Robert Davis, PhD, who is the author of a new book called Supersized Lies. And he is a health journalist who's been doing this for a long time and has been making his work all about helping people figure out the myths and misconceptions and wrong turns around weight loss. Now, the thing for you to know is Robert and I have not had a conversation before. And so we're both looking forward to just having a discussion. And you may find points where we agree and disagree. But the whole point of this is to give you the ability to kind of sit in and listen to 2 people in the field talk about the relevant science and the problems around weight loss. Robert, I'm really excited you're here. Congratulations on the new book. And let me just start us out with give us a little bit about your understanding, just so people know your understanding and your background. So maybe first your background, how you got in this space, and sort of your current view of the research in weight loss. And then we'll kind of go from there. I want you to start wherever you'd like.
Sure. Well, first of all, thank you, Jade, so much for having me. It's great to be with you. Yeah, my background, as you mentioned, is I'm a health journalist. And really, I come at this as somebody who has a personal passion when it comes to health. I'm an avid exerciser. I try to watch what I eat and practice what I preach. So going all the way back to college, I've had a strong personal interest in health. And I also have academic training in epidemiology and public health. So as a journalist, what I've tried to do is to take both my personal interest and also my academic training and apply that to look at the science to help the audience really understand what the science says. Because, as you said, there's so many claims out there, particularly around weight loss and nutrition and fitness and wellness, that are confusing and conflicting. And people are often overwhelmed by all the stuff we hear and all the noise. And so what I've tried to do in my work, and I've tried to do in this book and my previous books, is to actually look at the science as honestly and objectively and thoroughly as I can, to lay it out in a way that people can understand, hopefully, and allow people to make better decisions. Now, unlike you, I'm not a clinician, so I'm not in a position, and nor do I have the training to tell people what they should do or shouldn't do, and I don't pretend to do that. But what I do try to do is to lay out the information as well as I can, as honestly as I can, to help people make better decisions for themselves.
Yeah, I love this, Robert, because, it's really interesting. Not only are you a scientist, just so you guys know, Robert has a master's degree and a PhD, and he's a journalist. And it's really interesting. I'd like to just for a minute speak to the journalist background just for a second, because as you know, journalists have taken a beating and the media has kind of taken a beating in, the last several years. I love the idea of the integrity around journalism and how journalists approach things. I think scientists and journalists, at its core is really about uncovering the truth and giving people information. But can you just briefly give me a little bit of how you see this? Because I see that as interesting. You're both a scientist and a journalist, and they seem to have some overlap there, but I wonder what your sort of take on this idea is like journalism seems to not be the most trusted of sources anymore. And for someone like me, I think that's too bad, because I feel like journalists, at least when they take their work and they submit to media, at least there's a somewhat of a peer-reviewed process that's going on versus just making stuff up. It's not like you can just hit publish and not have someone actually check your work. And there's also a standard by which you do your work, which sounds a lot to me like science. So I'm just curious if you have any thoughts about that and want to kind of clue us in a little bit about the mindset of a journalist and the mindset of a scientist, so we can sort of set the frame, because I do think it's important in the way you approach this work in a sort of very non-biased, sort of non-judgmental, just get the information sort of point of view. And I think a lot of people misunderstand that.
Well, it's a great question, and I would say we could talk the whole time, obviously, just about that subject, but I'll try to be concise, give you a few thoughts. First of all, it is true that there is in a sense there are there should be at least checks and balances on what journalists do, and I think most journalists I know are trying their level best to do an honest job, to be fair, to lay out the information as thoroughly as they can. I don't know any journalist who just makes stuff up, and unfortunately. That's often the rap that journalists get, and it's not fair. The journalists are just making things up. That's not, most journalists don't do that. On the other hand, the problem is one of the shortcomings is that journalists are often in a hurry. And number two, like all people, they often buy into narratives, societal narratives, narratives in their newsroom, wherever the narratives may be, and allow those narratives to shape what they do. When it comes specifically to health information, which is what I obviously am focused on, one of the big problems, and I actually talk to health journalists and try to make them aware of these problems, is that journalists are too quick to believe the information that's coming into them from a press release, from some source, and not to critically analyze that information and just to pass it along without scrutinizing that information sufficiently. And so what happens is when the press release comes in that says food X will help you be healthier, or a certain diet will help you lose weight, that information is essentially passed along without that journalist looking at the science, really scrutinizing the evidence, because either they don't have time, or more likely they don't have the training to be able really to think critically and to know what's believable and what's not. And so I think in many cases, the problem isn't necessarily bad intentions on the part of journalists. It's just simply there's a limitation to their ability to be able to really think critically about that information and to put that information into context. And so the result is, particularly in health, we get information that's decontextualized, that's not put into proper context, and we're misled.
Yeah, I love that thought, because I always think that's one of the reasons I wanted to talk to you, right? Because I was like, oh, a science journalist. And that oftentimes is the issue. Journalists have sort of this way of looking at information, and they try to be in their integrity, but they don't often have the understanding and ability to read research in a critical way. And so that's one of the reasons why I was like, oh yeah, I definitely want to talk to you and see your take on this. So thank you for that. Let's get into this. So tell me, right wherever you want to start, what exactly is the problem? Obviously, we have a huge issue. We have a new diet fad every 5 years or so, multiple diet fads, multiple books coming out every year, information everywhere, and documentaries, podcasts, books, all about diet and exercise. You would think with all of this information that we would be seeing people get thin and being able to stay thin. But the fact of the matter is 95% of people who lose the weight regain it, 66% end up fatter. We have failed miserably as an industry in weight loss. Why is that? What is going on? What's your take, and what have you discovered in your research and in this book?
Well, there are a lot of answers to that, and I'll just talk about a couple. One certainly is money. The weight loss industry is estimated in the United States to be worth more than $60 billion annually. And so what we see is a number of players in that industry have a financial incentive to perpetuate a lot of these misleading ideas. Ideas such as, if you go on diet X, that's the diet and that will help you lose weight. That's the secret to lose weight. Or if you eat certain foods, diet-friendly foods, the food industry pushes all kinds of processed foods that are supposedly good for our weight. or the supplement industry pushes all kinds of pills, dietary supplements to supposedly help you lose weight, or gyms even. And again, I'm a huge proponent of exercise. We can talk about that, but gyms make false promises telling people come in, join the gym, you'll lose 30 pounds in 30 days, whatever it may be. The list goes on. The problem is there are all kinds of players in this field that profit from the spread of these misleading ideas. And the more people fail, the more money they make, because people just keep having to come back for more and more and more of the same stuff. So that's certainly one big reason that we see the kinds of, as you say, colossal failure we have because of the profit motive. Also, I just think there are a lot of biases, and I talk about this in the book, biases that affect not only, and I mentioned earlier, biases of journalists, but biases of health professionals as well as lay people. And I talk about these biases that can affect our thinking. For example, and just to list a couple, the bandwagon effect, the idea that if everybody believes something, we're more likely to believe it. So if everyone around us thinks that the keto diet or intermittent fasting or whatever it may be is the way to go, and that's the secret, we're more likely to believe that. And then a related bias is the allegiance bias. We see various allegiances to different approaches. So whether it's a vegan diet or whether it's a keto diet or whether it's a detox diet, whatever it is, that people sort of tend to cling to specific ideas and they won't let go, no matter what the evidence is that maybe this is not the best thing for everybody. And this includes professionals too, who tend to be advocates for a certain approach, and we get in these silos. And so that people, and this is reinforced by social media, where people get in echo chambers to believe that one particular approach is the only way to go. And so this, I think, creates this lack of success we're having, because people are focused on these narrow approaches, and they are just almost in some cases as though they're religious adherents to an idea rather than being open to other approaches. So I could go on, but those are certainly two factors, I think, that contribute to the situation we find ourselves in.
Yeah, I love it. It's funny, right? Nutrition and weight loss has gone the way of politics and religion, right? It's really about teams all of a sudden. And that's a big one. I love this because people who are familiar with this podcast and listen to this podcast, they've oftentimes heard me use the statement that bias or ignorance and arrogance are sort of the children of bias and dogma, or bias and dogma are the parents of ignorance and arrogance. Once you become so biased and dogmatic, you can no longer learn what you might need to know to get to where you would like to get. And I oftentimes see it too. It's almost like our maturity as humans, right? It's like level 1.0 thinking in diet and exercise, to my mind, is, hey, it worked for me, do what I do, right? And then level 2.0 thinking is kind of like, well, I specialize in people who do the, get on my team, get on the keto diet team. And I do think that level 3.0, which I think, this is my bias is that level 3.0 thinking is where we should be. And that is find and do what works for you. And I want to ask you about that sentiment. Based on what you have found, do we have any data that what I'm saying here is actually true? Is this something that you would say, yeah, Jade, that's kind of your bias too, and that's another form of bias? Or would you say this makes a little bit more sense? I'm just wondering where you see this kind of come down. Is it really just about that we're all different, or are there really specific diets that you have found actually work for all people? I'm curious.
No, you're absolutely. I agree with you 100%, Jade. We are all different, and the studies do show that. And we could point to it a lot of different lines of research. One certainly is genetics research, right? So we know there's studies in which they take people, they lock them up in dormitories and feed them a certain number of calories. And these are twins, actually, in some of these studies, and they find that between twin pairs, the twins are more likely to gain or lose a similar amount of weight as opposed to other twin pairs. And what that suggests to us, which we know from observing, is that some people can eat a lot of food and gain almost no weight. Those are people we hate. And some people the same. Then you take the other people that eat the same amount of food and they gain a lot of weight. And so just that alone tells us that people vary in terms of how they respond to diets. And so that alone, just genetics alone, and there are other factors too, our microbiome, the bacteria in our guts, that varies from person to person. Studies suggest that the mix of microbes in your gut can make a difference as well. And that varies from person to person too. So there are all kinds of individual differences that would help explain why people respond differently to different diets.
Yeah, I love that, right? I oftentimes use this phrase, and please tell me if you agree or disagree with this. I oftentimes say, we're each unique. We're unique in our physiology, which is what you're talking about, this idea of differences in microbiome, differences in genetics. I think it's the PRIDE study with continuous glucose monitoring shows that if Robert eats one food and I eat the exact same food, we can see very different glucose excursions, and we can even see changes in appetite that would vary between us. So that's the physiological differences. But then there's also psychological differences. The way that you handle stress, Robert, might be different than me. Maybe you lose your appetite. Maybe I want to, freebase 3 pints of Ben and Jerry's as a result of stress. And then, of course, there's personal preferences. Maybe I like chocolate. Maybe you like beer and Brussels sprouts. And then there's practical circumstances. Some people live in food deserts. Some people have the income to shop at Whole Foods. Some people go to farmers markets. I would suggest that this matters, and it matters a lot. And so when we're thinking about diet and exercise, from my perspective, it really is about taking these different aspects of us, what I call the 4 Ps of metabolism: physiology, psychology, preferences, and practical circumstances, and matching an appropriate diet to that. But here's what I want to ask you. When you've been going through your research, what have you found, and what does your book basically point out? Are there things that we can say work across the board for people? Are there people, for example, who have lost weight and been able to keep it off? And are there similarities between those groups of people in what they tend to do?
Well, what we do know is there's some general principles that tend to work across the board. Again, it doesn't mean that every one of these things works for everybody, but some things that tend to work long term. And remember, we know that weight management is not a sprint, it's a marathon. So any number of things can help people lose weight in the short term. But the real question is, as you say, most people gain weight back. So what's going to work over the long term, a year or longer, to help people keep that weight off? And so what we know is that for many people, the kind of diet that's often recommended for good health is also effective for long-term weight management. What is that? It's a diet that includes fruits, vegetables, whole grains, nuts, beans, seeds, fish, lean meats, and so forth, and that minimizes highly processed foods, things like chips and soda and sweets and fries, those kinds of foods that we know tend not to be good for us, highly processed foods. And so what the research suggests is that kind of diet can be effective for weight management over the long term. Now, what's great about that diet is that it allows for all kinds of customization. So again, as you say, it's very important to eat foods that you're going to enjoy and they're going to satisfy you, and not forcing yourself to eat things you don't like, because if you do that, no diet is going to be sustainable, or if you deprive yourself of foods that you enjoy. So the importance of that approach to eating, as I see it, is that it's very broad. You can tailor it to your needs. And again, these kinds of processed foods, it doesn't mean that you never touch them. It doesn't mean they're toxic. It doesn't mean you never have a piece of cake, but it means you try to, over time, modify your diet to change your eating habits so that eating cookies and cake and chips and so forth become occasional treats rather than everyday staples. And so that's a very different approach, as I see it, than a restrictive diet that says, here are the 10 foods you must never eat. Because again, those kinds of one-size-fits-all restrictive diets, for most people at least, in the long term don't work because they're very hard to maintain.
Sorry to break in. I want to cover one of my sponsors, Organifi. Now, look, I'm a little embarrassed to admit this, and many of you who know me well know this, but shockingly, I cannot stand vegetables. I really do not like vegetables. I have not liked them since a child. I think it has something to do with my mom, who cooked everything just boiled everything, no salt, no fat, no taste, period. And so I developed an extreme dislike for almost all vegetables. And still to this day, I have a difficult time getting in my fruits and vegetables. Well, Organifi, started by my good friend Drew Canoli, who I've developed a relationship over the years, and I am really sort of tickled that we finally get to do this together with Organifi sponsoring the Next Level Human podcast. Drew is a next level human. Organifi is a next level human company. I can't say enough about them. I'm excited for them to be on board as a sponsor for the Next Level Human podcast. My favorite products, let me tell you about them. They have a ton, but I use 3 pretty much every day. I use Organifi Gold before I go to sleep. This is their turmeric tea based on sort of the old Ayurvedic golden milk. It is absolutely fantastic. It contains lots of different relaxing herbs, turmeric, tastes wonderful. And one of the things this has done for me is I had a very bad wine habit at night. It started out as just one glass of wine. Lately, it's turned into 2, 3, and sometimes a bottle. What I've done starting in 2021 is use Organifi. This is what I have in lieu of wine. And I sit there just like I used to sit with my wine, and I have the Organifi Gold. I also use the green and red juice powders. I have never liked greens and reds juices, period. These powders to me always tasted like swamp water. I use 1 scoop of the greens, 1 scoop of the reds first thing in the morning before my coffee. It has become a ritual over the last several years. It is fantastic. Those are the ones I use the most. Of course, they have a great line of protein products, and they have a new Organifi Gold chocolate, which I have not tried yet, but I cannot wait to try that because you all know I love cocoa powder and use it for lots of different things, for cravings and everything else. Check out Organifi, Organifi.com. Use the code NEXTLEVEL. Please take care of Organifi the same way they're taking care of the earth, doing amazing things as a company, and now taking care of the Next Level Human podcast so we can all be together and have these discussions. Organifi.com, use the code NEXTLEVEL. I want to ask you a question. If you had to follow your friends around who are not the healthiest in the world and see what they are doing, what would be the number one thing you would probably tell them to do to start? For most people, that's going to be drinking more water, right? This is something that we talk about all the time in health and fitness. It's almost as if we think of it as an afterthought now because obviously water is so crucial. However, we oftentimes get this wrong. For example, did you know that when it comes to hydration, just drinking water can make things worse? Most people don't know this. Why? Partly because most people are over drinking water and under consuming the electrolytes that help water do its job. What we don't realize is that hydration is not just about water. It's about electrolytes, the minerals in there, as well as getting that water into the cells. And so you do not want to be over consuming water if you're not getting your electrolytes right. And this opens up a whole new discussion because most people are not getting their electrolytes right. For example, did you know that low sodium, too low sodium, is an issue? Just as much, if not more so, than high sodium. In other words, what we want if we're going to get the right electrolytes is to get the right amount of sodium and potassium and magnesium in the Goldilocks zone. We don't want too much. We don't want too little. We want it just right. This opens up a whole other thing here too, because people who are exercising, doing sauna therapies, doing low carb diets are disrupting and losing lots and lots of their electrolytes. For example, when insulin is not around in low carb diets, you will excrete lots of sodium. In other words, under that state, exercising, low carb diets, all these things, you actually need more sodium. And so if you're somebody who has been just drinking water, not paying attention to electrolytes, and also feeling fatigued, feeling like you're underperforming, not sleeping right, getting cramps, twitches, headaches, any of these things, then you are probably dealing with an electrolyte issue. This is where the product Element comes in. This product has been a game changer for me and many of my patients and clients. This is a rehydration electrolyte beverage, basically. It is a powder of electrolytes formulated with 1,000 milligrams of sodium, 200 milligrams of potassium, and 60 milligrams magnesium without the added sugar and other nonsense that comes in beverages like Gatorade. This stuff is basically a rehydration beverage on steroids. It is the thing that is going to replenish your electrolytes in the right ratios, decrease fatigue, really correct chronic dehydration. And by the way, many people are dehydrating themselves, becoming hyponatremic, low sodium, when they're consuming too much water. You need your electrolytes on board, especially if you are someone who is losing lots of sodium and other electrolytes through low-carb diets and lots of exercise. This is where Element comes in. Element is a new sponsor to the Next Level Human podcast. I cannot recommend this product enough. I have been using this stuff for months now, and I have immediately seen changes in my energy levels. I feel like I'm operating on a whole other level, and I have seen this as being the primary thing that people who have been using Element have been telling me, that their fatigue is getting better, especially fatigue that comes after very intense workouts that involve lots of sweating and lots of intense output from the nervous system. Please check out Element. Use the code NEXTLEVEL. DrinkElement.com. That's DrinkElement.com. DrinkElement.com, and let's get back to the show. Yeah, so based on your research, it sounds like, and correct me if I'm expressing this wrong, but it sounds like this idea of demonizing foods, whether you're a vegan that says never have, meats, or whether you're a keto diet person that says you should never have carbs and they're toxic, is not true. Perhaps based on what you're saying, and that a better approach is to look at whole, foods that tend to satisfy us, tend to be nutrient dense, tend to be relatively calorie sparse in themselves, or keep you from overeating lots and lots of calories, but that there are many, many different flavors of this. And I have one question here that comes up a lot. How do you make sense of things like, because, Pete, there's an argument that goes on about quality versus quantity of food, right? And one of the ways I've always seen this is it's funny what our industry does, or the health industry does. They tend to want to dichotomize everything. They kind of want to say, some people say quality is more important. Other people say quantity is more important. I'm one of these people that says that's like arguing between the gas pedal and the steering wheel in a car. They're both equally important in my mind. But how do you see that? Is that true or is that not? I want to know about your take on calories. A lot of people say calories don't matter. What does your research say in terms of quality versus quantity? Do calories matter? Is it both? Is it one or the other? What are your thoughts on that?
Well, first of all, I agree with you completely. Both matter in terms of both quality, the quality of your diet. Certainly, that's what we were just talking about. That's what that kind of diet I was just describing is. It's focusing on the overall quality of your diet, but also the amount that you eat certainly matters as well. So both matter, and I think it's a false debate. I agree with you. As for calories, counting calories, what I like to say is that calories count, that is, calories matter, but counting calories often fails for people. And the reason is that it's just very hard to do precisely. It's hard to know how many calories we're getting, even though you have a number on the package, it'll say 173. That number is not necessarily accurate. Those numbers in the US can be off by up to 20%. And you add unrealistic serving sizes on top of that. So often we really don't have a good idea about how many calories we're getting. Never mind that many of the foods we eat, we don't have calories counts for. If we eat at home, if we go to a friend's house, we go to a party, we often don't know. So it's very hard to know how many calories we're getting. It's also hard to know how many calories we're really actually burning or need to burn in order to be in calorie deficit. We have apps and so forth that can maybe help us do that, but they're not necessarily that accurate. So the problem is it's very hard to do accurately. And then on top of that, as we said before, there are individual differences when it comes to how our bodies respond to calories. There are genetic differences, there are differences with our microbiome, and there are metabolic differences. So once we start consuming fewer calories and losing weight, our metabolism slow down. Some people's more than others, but if you keep eating the same number of calories, it's going to be harder and harder to maintain that weight loss and to lose more weight. And so that's not taken into account either when people simply look at calories. And then finally, I would just say that calories are not necessarily the best indicator of the quality of your diet. Again, it's in conflict with that. You can have a low-calorie diet that's a lousy diet when it comes to the healthfulness of that food and how well that food's going to help you feel full and how it's going to affect your metabolism. And so, again, I like to say that calories, yes, it's a good idea to have a general sense of how many calories you're consuming, but when you fixate on calories and not on other aspects of what you're eating, I think that's a mistake.
Yeah, that's a really interesting thing. You and I are actually way more similar than I thought we might have been, which is, always cool, but maybe we'll find some areas of disagreement that we can discuss. I oftentimes say the same thing. I say calories matter, and perhaps they matter a lot, but it's not necessary for all people to count them. And yeah, it's a trip, right? I know the same research you're looking at. I mean, when you really start digging into this, 20% is a huge difference, in terms of calorie counts being off for particular things. And not only that, I'll add another stat to that, and you could tell me if you know this stat as well, but about 30% of the food we eat, which is a whole meal basically, gets lost over time, meaning that when we might be able to track our diet for a day, but over a week, we forget certain things that we eat. And when researchers follow individuals around who are trying to pay attention to their diet, inevitably over several weeks, they find that they are underestimating their calories by up to 30%. So now we have two numbers here, these calorie tracking things, MyFitnessPal and things like that, packages on foods could be off by 20%. And we might be missing up to 30% of the calories that we take in that we're eating based on serving sizes and based on just forgetting to record certain things anyway. So it makes it extremely difficult. It's funny, Robert, one of the things that I used to be in my first couple books that I wrote, I used to be very much on the hormonal quality side of the equation. That was my bias. And then I've kind of swung back to the middle. And ironically, one of the things that made me swing back to the middle is watching my pets. Right? Like, I'm like, well, if it works for my dog, because I can regulate what my dog eats, I can have full control over what goes in the dog's mouth. Right. And inevitably, as soon as I began to regulate my dog's intake, that she is going to begin to lose weight. And that's one of the things that I was like, well, if it works for a dog, it's going to work for humans. But you brought up something that I want us to get into, two things here. One is what I would call the law of metabolic compensation, which essentially says the metabolism doesn't work like a calculator. It works more like a thermostat. It is adaptive and reactive. So you just alluded to this. When we cut calories, it cuts energy expenditure, right? And it also upregulates, hunger and craving. So now we have sort of this three-part process. One, calorie levels are not accurate. Two, we underestimate even if they were, or overestimate, or underestimate rather, even if they were accurate. And then our metabolism adapts and reacts by slowing things down and ramping up hunger and cravings. And this makes things extremely difficult. So I'm wondering, do you have anything to add there, anything to correct me on, and most especially anything to kind of help us mitigate some of this metabolic reactivity?
Well, first of all, yes, I agree with you. And I like to say it's an evolutionary gift that we don't necessarily want anymore, but it's something that certainly helped our ancestors in times of scarcity and famine. That is to say, their bodies essentially, or our bodies, become more fuel efficient when our bodies sense that we're facing famine. And so it helps us stay alive. And so you're right. And so scientists have a name for this, adaptive thermogenesis, which means metabolism slows down even more than it would for somebody who's at that size. So let's say somebody goes from 200 pounds down to 150, their metabolism slows in many cases at 150, even more than somebody whose metabolism is where the metabolism would be if they'd started at 150 pounds. So it's as though biology is stacked against us. And so I think that's what you're asking is a really important question in terms of whether certain things that we do can help override that. The answer is that I think there's not a lot of great, at least definitive science as to what we can do to try to counter that process, though I do think that there is evidence that, again, the kind of diet that I'm talking about, which is a whole foods diet that helps address the hunger issues you're describing when hunger gets ramped up, and helps maybe quell some of these hunger hormones that come into play to cause us to have an increased appetite. The kind of diet that you and I both agree on that can be, or I don't like to use diet, the kind of eating plan that can be effective when it comes to those kinds of hormonal and metabolic changes.
Yeah, let's all keep in mind what Robert is saying too. I mean, part of this diet is, let's not forget that he talks about adjusting this, right, to fit our physiology, psychology, preferences, and practical circumstances. But it's great. I call this idea structured flexibility, by the way. It's basically like, here's a structure of a general way of eating, but then we need to be flexible within that to find the foods that fill us up fast, keep us full for longer, and satisfy us enough, but not so much that it's pinging these hedonistic centers in the brain to make us, essentially overeat. And then taking into account this metabolic compensation. How do you feel about the different macronutrients? If you come across any research or any sort of information around how macronutrients like carbohydrates or fats or protein might help mitigate some of this stuff or make a difference for us? Or is this also something we really shouldn't be worrying too much about?
Well, there is evidence, and again, it's somewhat mixed, but that protein can be helpful. So I think it's a reasonable thing to try. And again, it's going to vary from person to person, as we agree on, but to include protein at all your meals. And a lot of people recommend that, including some protein, that protein's more likely to fill you up. The same with fat. Fat is more likely to leave you feeling full as opposed to carbs. And then when it comes to carbs, not all carbs are the same. So complex carbs are more likely to help fill you up, the kinds of carbs you would get from fruits and vegetables and whole grains, as opposed to the kinds of carbs you get from processed foods. So I think that there's at least evidence that in some people that paying attention to these macros can make a difference.
Yeah, I would agree there, right? It's like, for those of you who are not savvy on this, one of the ways to think about this is the different macronutrients can fill you up differently. So protein does seem to be very satiating. And again, as Robert's pointing out, it's going to vary from person to person. So perhaps, there are some people that maybe carbohydrates are more satiating, and that would, but in general, in the research, we tend to see a trend that protein seems to be the most satiating and also the most thermogenic macronutrient. So that may be sort of playing a role there. And I would agree with you in terms of one of the things I oftentimes say is protein, fiber, and water is a really good bet. So you got vegetables, non-starchy vegetables and fruits, which are loaded with water, loaded with fiber. They also tend to be extremely nutrient dense. And then you got lean proteins, that essentially fill you up without a lot of the calories. And in my mind, it's not that I'm saying fat and carbohydrates are bad, because I don't really like the idea of, demonizing any food group. It's just that when you combine fat and carbohydrates, they tend to be the bulk load of calories. And they also can, in combination, tend to, trigger some of this hedonistic effect in the brain and make you overeat. And I'm wondering if you talk about any of that kind of stuff, highly palatable foods, things that go on in the food industry, combining fat, sugar, salt, alcohol, sort of these, highly palatable foods and what they might do to the hunger centers in the brain. Do you have any information on that for us? Is it just simply stick with the whole food, stay away from processed foods in general? Or is there anything to this idea that processed foods can hijack the brain in a way in terms of our appetite centers and craving control?
No, I think there's emerging evidence that suggests that. So it's not just that they are, not good for us in a variety of ways, but that they actually can have these, as you say, really pernicious effects and cause us to actually it's not just they don't fill us up the way that whole foods do, but they cause us, they do a number on our brains and cause us to crave more foods and to want to eat more and more of these foods. And so, yes, I think there's good evidence that's emerging that suggests that these are a real problem for a variety of reasons. And the food manufacturers know this. These foods are exquisitely designed to elicit that very response from us, to make us want to eat the whole bag of potato chips, to want us to eat, the whole bag of cookies, whatever the case may be. And so it's no accident that these foods have this effect, because they've actually been designed to have that effect.
Yeah, love it. I mean, the title of the book is Supersized Lies. And I want to kind of know now, just what would you say in terms of the biggest myths? Why don't you walk us through some of the most surprising findings for you? Was there anything in this book as you were doing your research that you were just like, oh my gosh, I'm surprised at that? Or, this is definitely something everyone needs to know. What are the biggest things that you think are the take homes that people really need to know, or the things that have surprised you the most in terms of the work that you've done?
Well, I mean, I would say, again, these may not be shocking to people, but one is just, we've touched on this idea of villains, and so many diets are built around this idea of villains that if only you cut out, name it, fats, carbohydrates, sugar, gluten, whatever the case may be, that it's all about a villain. So if you cut out a villain, then you're going to lose weight. And this sort of reducing, as you say, this very complex phenomenon, which is multifaceted, that is weight management, down to one kind of food. And if only you get rid of that food, then you'll lose weight and keep it off. I think that's perhaps the biggest myth of all. And unfortunately, that's the principle behind a number of these diets that are often, sold to us. And so I think that's a huge problem. I also think, just sort of a larger kind of point, and this really was driven home to me as I was writing the book, is that everything is entirely within your control. And if you don't lose the amount of weight that you're expecting to lose, it's your fault. You are not diligent enough. You're not trying hard enough. You're lazy. And so many people who struggle with their weight, and I've always known this from people, friends and family who struggle with their weight, but certainly I became much more acutely aware of it from writing the book and interviewing people. The way that people internalize this idea and engage in self-blame and feel like failures when they go through weight cycling and they lose weight and gain weight and lose weight and gain even more weight. And they feel, I'm a failure. I have, my friend, this diet worked for my friend. It worked for people on Instagram. It's not working for me. There's something wrong with me. When in fact, there's something wrong with the diets. And as you say, they haven't found something that's appropriate for them, but they've been led to believe that this is the best way. And so if it's not working, it's their fault. And so what happens? Not only is their health harmed, but there's great potential psychological and emotional harm, because people, there's self-stigma, there's people blame themselves. And this really, I think, further exacerbates the problem and makes it even harder to continue on a quest to lose weight and to be healthy. And so I think that this idea that everything is entirely within our control, that if we only do certain things and if it doesn't work, it's therefore our fault, I think that's a huge problem. And I think you could argue that's the biggest myth of all, that I think is just having, in many cases, very serious consequences, both physically and emotionally for so many people.
Robert, I love that one, because I just think that is a huge one, because what it does is starts pointing to the mental emotional sort of aspect of weight loss and the mental emotional turmoil that the weight loss industry can have on us. One of the things you said in there, I think, is interesting, though. It's kind of like this thing where it's not your fault. One of the things I oftentimes think about is if people really understood the way metabolism worked and stopped trying to force their agenda on their metabolism and instead tried to learn the language of metabolism. Like I oftentimes say, the metabolism doesn't speak English, it speaks metabolism. And so what you need to do is understand what your metabolism is actually saying. And it is sending biofeedback to us all the time in the forms of how hungry we are, how many cravings we're having, what is our sleep like, what is our mood like. When you eat correctly, you will see some of the positive benefits of this. You shouldn't be hungry all the time, right? Or at least you should be in control of it. You shouldn't be having insatiable cravings and unpredictable, unstable energy and digestive upset and all of this kind of stuff. So one of the things I have often said is that if you're, quote, doing everything right, meaning you're following an off-the-shelf protocol, a keto diet, a vegan diet, or whatever it is, and you think you're doing everything right and not getting results, well, then you're not doing everything right. And what you're not doing right, in my mind, is you're outsourcing the wisdom of your metabolism and the things that your metabolism is telling you on a daily basis to someone else. Maybe someone like me, because I've written a book, right? Maybe someone on a podcast, because they tend to, teach certain things and something worked for them. So I love what you said right there, because it speaks to this idea of freeing yourself first from outsourcing this information. And then second of all, going in and saying, how does the metabolism actually work? And what is my unique metabolism saying to me based on the food choices that I'm making? I really, really like that idea, because at that point, then it changes the subject in a sense and starts saying, hey, stop looking for off the shelf diets out there and learn this process. So I'm curious for you, I guess my final question in this, are there processes that you have seen in the research that tend to work better? For example, I'm aware of the weight loss registry, successful weight loss users, and kind of what they tend to do. Some of the things I am aware of is they do tend to be movers rather than sitters. They do tend to eat less processed foods and more whole foods, like you're talking about. They do tend to pay attention to what's going on with their weight and regularly weigh themselves. They do tend to pay attention to food in some way, shape, or form, whether it's looking at macros or generally paying attention to calories or looking at portion sizes. Is there anything else that you could tell us about processes that we might want to pay attention to based on the research that you have looked at?
Well, no, you just named a lot of the ones, and you the weight control, U.S. weight control registry that you just referred to, which is people who've lost, I think it's at least 30 pounds and kept it off. Mm-hmm. And so that's a great, it's an amazing research project and database of folks, and we can learn a lot from that. Again, it's not to say that this is some kind of, prescriptive exercise where we say, okay, let's look at what they did and we have to do everything they did and it's right for us, because as we keep saying, everybody's different. But you're right, all those things you listed are things that are common to a lot of the folks in the registry that they've done. Let me, if I may I talk about a couple of them?
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay, so let's talk about exercise. I think that's an important, which we've not touched on, because the research, and again, I'm a huge proponent of exercise. My last book was about exercise. I think it's the closest thing we have to a fountain of youth. That said, exercise, the studies show exercise is not great when it comes to actually losing weight. It's not that effective for a variety of reasons, including the fact that a typical exercise that most of us do is not going to burn a lot of calories. However, it's very important, according to research, when it actually comes to maintenance, that is keeping weight off and avoiding weight gain in the first place. So I think moving your body, and it doesn't mean you have to join a gym if you don't want to. It doesn't mean you have to, go lift heavy weights, but moving your body, combination of aerobic training and resistance exercises, which can be in all kinds of different forms, is important. That combination is important for maintaining weight loss. So that's crucial. Weighing yourself, you mentioned that regularly. That's an interesting question. And this gets back to our discussion about individual differences. There's good evidence from the weight control registry and elsewhere that weighing yourself regularly, every week, every day, can be very effective at long-term weight maintenance. However, there's a flip side to that, which says that for some people, it can cause great distress, and it can cause them to be more fixated on the number and it cause emotional distress. And so I think, again, people need to figure out if that can help motivate you to stay on track. By all means, weigh yourself every day or every week, whatever the case may be. But if it's causing problems for you and it's causing you to get upset when you lost half a pound because of changing water weight, then don't do that and weigh yourself less often. So that's an example of a thing that can work for a lot of people, but it shouldn't be necessarily a rule that you must follow if in fact it's going to be counterproductive for you.
Yeah, I love that. And one tidbit I can give people here is that exercise is really interesting, because for some people, about 25% of people in the reading that I've done and the research that I've done, 25% of people don't get sort of the compensatory eating responses when they exercise, especially aerobic exercise. And it works well for those 25%, but the other 75% overcompensate with eating when they're over exercising. So what a lot of people don't realize is that their over exercising habit can sometimes be related or the direct cause of their overeating habit. And this is what Robert's sort of alluding to here. Not to mention some of I don't know if you're familiar with Herman Ponzer's work. I had him on this podcast as well. And he just wrote the book Burn, with this constrained metabolism effect. When you exercise, after several weeks of exercising, your body can make up the difference later. And I think this is tricky. And what I mean by that, for those of you who don't know what I mean by that, go back and watch that episode with Dr. Herman Ponzer on constrained exercise metabolism. But all it essentially means, if the body sees itself burning up a lot of calories in one area, it will begin to budget in other areas. Now, we're not yet clear in the science where it's taking this stuff from, but we know that it is doing some kind of accounting here. And this is why exercise can be a little bit tricky. But I love that you're making a distinction here, because I think what a lot of people would go is they would go, okay, well, that means don't exercise. But if you're listening to what Robert's saying, that's not it at all. Actually, what it's saying is that maybe dieting is the most important thing to attain weight loss. But when it comes to maintaining weight loss, which is the harder thing to do, exercise becomes absolutely critical. Not only that, it's incredibly healthy. So is there anything else you feel like we haven't covered here? I mean, I'm so grateful for this work. I'm surprised. I guess I'm not too surprised, but it seems like you and I are in agreement, which is always fun. Like, we couldn't really find many areas where we could have a discussion here. But it is nice, because one of the nice things with people listening is here's two guys who don't know each other, who've done research independently, and we do seem to be converging in a lot of areas here, which is nice, because it essentially says that maybe, and of course, I'm sure Robert will tell you the same thing. There's so much to learn in this industry. We know a lot. We know a lot less than we think we know, and so we'll see how things pan out. But it seems like there is a lot of convergence here, which I think may be comforting to some people listening to this. But is there anything else you want to add? Something that you're like, Jade, we really would be remiss if we didn't mention this, or anything else you think that the listener should know?
Well, I would just add, Jade, I think it's important for people, because so many people I know just feel that they're banging their heads against the wall, trying one diet after another, and maybe getting short-term success, but then the diet stops working and they gain the weight back. And I would just say, to the point that we certainly agree on about individual differences, is that to think beyond just a diet, and to try to seek out help if you need to from somebody who can help you tailor a program that works for you. So a professional like you, who's knowledgeable, who can help people figure out what's right for them. And there are various ways you can do that, different kinds of professionals, somebody like you who has training, others who have training in diet, but who can help you focus on and have the same philosophy that we're talking about, that understand that everybody's different and you need to figure out what's going to work for you. And sometimes it requires a professional to help you figure that out. And that can be done through working professionals. There's certain commercial programs that focus on what's called intensive behavioral therapy, that is focusing on what you're eating and the other habits around weight management. But I think trying to essentially work with a coach or a professional to help you figure that out can be very effective.
Yeah, and I think this book, Supersized Lies, your book, I'm so grateful for it, because I think that ultimately what we really do need is to set the record straight. I mean, we need to be honest in this industry. We need to be evidence-based in this industry, and we need people to kind of get straight on what matters and what doesn't. So thank you so much for that work. Where can people find you, Robert, in terms of if they want to follow up with you, follow along with your work? I mean, obviously you have several books on Amazon, but where else are you active on social media and that kind of stuff? Where can people find you if they want more info from you?
They can go to my website, healthyskeptic.com, and there find information about this book and my other books about how to purchase them. I also have created a number of short videos on some of the topics, on many of the topics we talked about today, as well as other topics. So I invite people to go check out those videos on healthyskeptic.com. And then also they can follow me on Facebook, Robert Davis Healthy Skeptic, and on Instagram, I'm Healthy Skept, SKEPT.
Perfect. Thank you so much, my friend. I just told you I got to run because I got another call. So I'm going to go ahead and end it here, but I will see you on social media. Thanks again so much for your work.
Thank you, Jade.
All right. Be good.
Thank you.